to another Moviescramble podcast. We are doing something a little bit different in this episode. We are comparing two identical films, one in its original Swedish and its English language remake. So joining me today is someone who would be called handsome in any language. It's John. How are you?
Yeah, getting me laughing first thing. Well done. Yeah, very happy with that. Your introductions are getting more and more sugary, shall we say, as we go along, because you're always saying nice things to me, and then one of these times you're going to say something completely horrible to me during the introduction, and I just won't know what to say. But
it's just going to knock you off course, yeah.
Yeah, at least I'm aware. Yeah, I'm good. I've been on holiday for a couple of weeks, had a nice time. It's actually been really nice and sunny in Scotland for the people who tune into this show just for the weather report that we usually do at the start of it. And yeah, it's been okay. I've had quite a nice summer, which is always good. And how are you doing?
Really well. Not been anywhere away as yet, hoping that we could potentially get something later on in the year, but just enjoying the sunshine that lasted up until the point of recording this podcast because it has pissed sideways all day. Mm-hmm. But actually, perhaps the gloomy weather is appropriate for what we're going to discuss because it's not exactly all sunshine and rainbows either. So, as I said, we're comparing basically the same film. We have A Man Called Ove, which is from 2015, directed by Hannes Holm, and A Man Called Otto, which came out in 2022, directed by Mark Oster. So both of these films are based on Fredrik Backman's hugely successful novel, A Man Called Ove. In the Swedish film, Ove is played by Rolf Lassgård, and in the English language film, he becomes Otto, and he is played by Tom Hanks. In both films, the titular character is a curmudgeon, the neighbourhood grump and busybody, but the reality is that he misses his wife who's passed away and wants to take his own life to be reunited with her. In both films, boisterous new neighbours show up and change the course of events. So there are two translations at play here. There's page to screen and then Swedish to English. How do you feel generally about both kinds of adaptations?
In general, both of them worked. Both of them did what they were supposed to do. It was interesting the fact that the English language version cited both the book and the Swedish language film as its references within the titles of the film's actually opening. So it was of no surprise that there was a lot of overlap between the two films in terms of the actual plot, the storytelling, and the characters. Now, there was a wee bit of difference in some of the minor ones, but all the major characters were roughly the same in them. And for what it was worth, yes, they both worked because they both used the same sort of reference. They're both original references, I think. What did you think?
Yeah, well, I sobbed my way through the book, and I don't usually cry at books, but this is generally this was proper tears and snotters reading that. It was so emotional. So I was quite skeptical going into both adaptations, actually. But I thought both did a really good job in a slightly different way from each other. I think there's enough to differentiate them that you don't feel that you've watched the same film back to back. And I actually think that both of them in their own way are quite faithful to the text, while making some changes, obviously, especially in the English language version. And I am a snob, as I've said on this podcast many times. I hate book-to-screen adaptations and I hate English language remake adaptations. But actually, in both cases here, I thoroughly enjoyed what I watched. And I say enjoyed, I sobbed my way through both of these films as well.
Yeah. There were moments in it where it got a bit dusty in the room. Yes, I would agree with that. Yes.
Somebody must have been cutting onions consistently. So yes, it's definitely what I would say to our listeners is do not watch these films back to back because you will cry so much that it's ridiculous. But actually they are a nice sort of point of comparison because I think that Hannes Holm, who directed the Swedish language version, actually is listed as a writer on the English language version. Did you think that sort of stylistically there was much to separate the two directors? Because I do think when you've got a source text, it can be quite difficult to put your own stamp on things. But do you think that was there anything that stood out to you in either version that you thought, oh, that's quite different from what I've seen previously?
Not really, no, because a lot of it was, like I said, was very similar. The way that it was set. I like the touch, obviously, with Sweden, you get quite harsh winters and everything. So therefore there was certain scenes were set when it was kind of snowing and stuff. So they deliberately set it in the American setting in a place where it would be similar to that. It was Philadelphia. I think they set it so they could have the same sort of climate so that they can have these storytelling elements about like shoveling snow off of the sidewalk and all this kind of thing. So in that way, yes, there wasn't much difference. Now, I watched A Man Called Otto first, which
So did
I watched. I watched that maybe about 6 or 7 months ago. I watched A Man Called Ove yesterday, and I rewatched A Man Called Otto today. And because they were both fresh in my mind from watching them, it was so similar in so many ways. But it wasn't unenjoyable. And like you say, there was enough in between to take something and say, yeah, that's different to that film. And I quite enjoyed that part of it. But yes, I thought it was very similar. I thought maybe Mark Forster would have tried to put some sort of stamp onto it. But then again, maybe that wasn't the exercise he was trying to sort of, pursue. He was just being as faithful as possible to the remake, which can be a bit of a cop-out sometimes when you get remakes of a film and they're just exactly the same. I'm looking at Psycho, for instance.
That's exactly what I thought when you said that, yeah.
But yes, and there was enough time between them as well. Like I say, there was 7 years between them. So it wasn't like some remakes which are announced almost as soon as the film comes out. The likes of, what was the Argentinian one that would get remade? It was a Julia Roberts film.
Oh, I'm not thinking of that. I was thinking of Let the Right One In.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's another good example as well. Yep. I will remember the film. It was a detective drama. And it was
Julia Roberts' detective drama?
Yeah. It was The Secrets in Their Eyes, I think it was called. And it was a Argentinian film that won awards and everything, and they did an English language remake of it, and she was the main lead in it, which was it was a good film, but it really suffered by comparison because it had so much of the original film in there, and they didn't do it as well. Now with this one, yes, they did it as well. And they were respectful of the fact that that film is there. Now, the whole point of an English language remake is that most people haven't seen the Swedish film in the sort of English language territories, and they can't be bothered reading while they're looking at something as well. So, yeah, there's that. But I felt the time in between it meant that it was okay. And like I say, it was respectful as well.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a lot of pressure because A Man Called Ove obviously had 2 Oscar nominations, and the book is like a huge international bestseller. And Friedrich Bachmann's other, I think it's follow-up novel called Anxious People, also got made into a Netflix series as well about a sort of bank robbery that there's a big kind of twist at the end, so I'll not spoil it. But I think there probably would have been quite a certain amount of weight against this before it's even started, because even if you haven't seen the Swedish original, I suspect a lot more, in this case, I suspect actually a lot more people would have read the book, even if they hadn't watched the film. So I guess for me, one of the big things is obviously the title change. And part of me has an issue with the fact that they did change the titular character's name, but I understand why they've done it, because obviously Ove is a very Swedish name. Does things like that bother you, or am I just being a nitpick?
Well, yes, you are.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
No.
Confirmation I needed.
It would be nice if they kept the same name, but they are looking at an English language audience who will not know that Ove is a name. They would,
for starters, exactly.
They would say, "What's an Ove?" A Man Called Ove. Why do you call Ove? It could be construed as being something entirely different as opposed to a name. So like Otto is a bit more palatable. And I mean, we've talked about this lots of times in the past. It's all down to money, isn't it?
Yeah.
They'll change the title of a film because it's more marketable, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I just thought it was interesting. Sorry, because the book was, because I definitely know people have read the book, and I just thought because of that familiarity, maybe they'd have got away with it.
Yeah, but if you have a book, a film, and a second film, and they're all called the same thing, when you Google it, what's it going to come up with first? Is it going to come up with the book? Going to come up with the original film or the remake? You know, it just depends on how popular each of the searches are, like all the SEO rankings and all that. So all that would have been taken into consideration as well. But yes, it's definitely an anglicised version of the name as well. And I mean, they changed some of the other names and stuff like that as well, and various other characters. But you're right, that's the title of the film. But it didn't bother me really. It's acceptable. You kind of accept these things.
Yeah, no, for me, it was just because, as I say, it's a book that I was very, very familiar with. I just think it was quite a bold choice, but I do get why they've done it, I guess. So what did you think of the two Oves, Ottos? So you've got Rolf Lassgård, Swedish version, and Tom Hanks, America's Granddad, in the English language version. What do you think each man sort of brought to the role?
I think Rolf was more of a curmudgeon
definitely
in his portrayal than Tom Hanks was. It was kind of interesting as well because Ove was noted as being 59 years old in the film because they said, you know, you can do something else, you can retire early. Whereas I think the Tom Hanks character, or Tom Hanks version, was about 10 years older. Because you saw it in the gravestone at one point with the dates, and I'm not really giving very much away here because so many people have read the book, but he was markedly older, but they looked the same age. Rolf's version looked older than a 59-year-old man. He looked probably about at least 5 years older. He looked as if he was like kind of at sort of our sort of retirement age, whereas Tom Hanks looked slightly older than that again. So there was that kind of difference, but there was also the physical imposition as well. Like we mentioned when we were off air, Rolf Lassgård is 6'5", something like that. Did you say
something like 6'4", apparently, according to IMDb?
So he's a more imposing character as well. So the whole point of this character is it's like a grumpy old man who's you know, just basically shouting at the world. You can get away with it more if you're a big guy rather than Tom Hanks, who's slightly weird. There is a scene in it where he's out driving and he confronts another driver and he pulls the driver out of the car and threatens him. Now, having a big 6'5" guy doing that to somebody looks plausible.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But then in the American version of it, when Tom Hanks does it, it doesn't have the same heft because he's not much. He's about the same height as the guy and everything. And the guy's maybe got like a 25-year age gap on him. So you're thinking, he couldn't do that. It's not quite
absolutely.
the same.
And the same goes for when they confront the developers in the estate. And you've got the wee guy who comes out the car, who, if he's lucky, comes up to, you know, Ove's like belly button, and you can see physically how much he towers over him. Whereas when Tom Hanks is confronting them again, it's this because Tom Hanks's frame is so slender in this as well. So he's actually got quite a slender frame as well as being that bit shorter. It didn't make him seem that much of a threat, but equally, you've got the converse side of that where perhaps Tom Hanks's version seemed a bit more pathetic because he did seem that bit more vulnerable.
Yes, that's true. He did come across as being a more vulnerable sort of character, which within the confines of that works really well because you didn't see that in the original Swedish. It was more full frontal, you know, just nasty old guy without being like nasty. And everything that he did, you got repulsed by what he did, but with some of the stuff that Tom Hanks' version was doing, you weren't quite as repulsed. There was the bit early on where he was like berating the delivery driver, and he says the guys in the white van, when they when they deliver much more respectively. Why is there always a problem with you brown guys? And then he says, "That's not a racist comment, by the way."
I did chuckle at that, but yeah, I definitely feel like, and I don't know if that's just a choice just for different audiences, but I definitely feel like they softened that character up a little bit to make him seem, whereas I mean, Rolf Lassgård, I just thought could have physically kicked the shit out of anyone in his estate, for starters. And he definitely was, I think from the offset, I mean, both characters start with trying to purchase something in a shop and it doesn't go well, and they have an argument with the cashier. With the Tom Hanks version, he's trying to buy rope. Again, that's no spoilers. And his argument seems sort of almost kind of like lame and just sort of like nitpicky, whereas Rolf Lassgård's version, it's like he seems mildly threatening as much as anything else. And again, it's just a choice. It is very much choices that both the directors and the actors have made. But I did think that for me, it seemed interesting that for English language audiences, certainly the character seemed a lot more soft. So I don't know if maybe you feel the same way. Like, did you feel in this sort of the scenes where obviously he's trying to remove himself from this earth, did you feel like one had more of an impact than the other? Were you more emotionally invested in one version of the character, or?
Yes, and I think it was the way that they framed these episodes, because in the Swedish version there was a voiceover element used, especially when they used the suicide attempts as flashbacks. So they would use that, and they would go into the past, and there would be this. It was a voiceover for pretty much the entirety of these scenes, and they used that maybe 2-3 times to explain everything that was going on in the past. Whereas in the other version, they changed it slightly. They didn't have a voiceover for a start, so that meant that Otto had to explain more to somebody else, to another character, about what was happening in the past and all that. And they still showed some of it, but it didn't have the same impact, I don't think. So in that way, the storytelling in the Swedish one suited me better in terms of the way that they actually got it across. I liked that slightly better. If I'd never seen the Swedish one, and obviously I hadn't seen the Swedish one, and I watched the Man Called Otto version, it was perfectly acceptable at the time, the way that came across. But when you saw that version and how they did it, you thought, that's what they should have done. That was better. It was better. But yeah, I kind of feel I'm nitpicking a wee bit with it, because they are so similar.
Yeah, and I do. I mean, don't get me wrong. The sort of like intense close up of Tom Hanks' face with the Kate Bush song in the background. I was burst. I actually have to pause it because I was just like, as I say, just sobbing. I was like, how dare they? This is Tom Hanks. I think that's maybe part of the issue that I have, is that because Tom Hanks himself is like so beloved, and as I say, he's like America's granddad, I sometimes have trouble, not in all his films right enough, but I do sometimes have trouble, a bit like Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise always plays Tom Cruise. I sometimes have, in his most recent work anyway, and especially because he's probably around the same age as the character he's playing, I sometimes have trouble separating how I feel about Tom Hanks as a person and the character that he's playing. But you mentioned flashbacks there, which actually brings me nicely onto my next thought. How effective did you feel the flashbacks were used in each film? Because both films do use them to try and help you get to know the character a little bit better. But obviously your preference there was for the way the Swedish film had done it. So to give listeners some context, Ove sort of goes back to his past. We see him as a young man, how he meets his wife, Sonia, played by Ida Engvall in the Swedish version, and Rachel Keller in the English language version. And we just get a sense of how he was shaped as a young man, meeting his wife, and how they sort of set up their life together, I guess.
Yeah. The colour palettes, for a start, were different between present day and the past, and that was replicated in both films. The Swedish one, it was lovely colours and everything. And the first thing that he sees when he meets her are her shoes, and they're bright red.
Gorgeous red shoes, yes.
Yeah, they were very nice. And that kind of sets the tone of these flashbacks. The flashbacks are all pretty, for the most part, they're pretty nice because they're explaining sort of happy times. Now, that isn't always the case as the story unfolds, of course, but I thought the flashbacks were used, like I say, they were used better in the Swedish one because they gave you a certain amount of information and then come back to the present. It didn't tell you just a wee drip of the story or too much of it. It was actually, what do they call it, the Goldilocks. Goldilocks effect. It was just enough. It wasn't too much, too little, and they worked particularly well. Now in the US one, it had the added bonus of Tom Hanks' son actually playing him, which was a really nice touch actually, because he had that sort of familiarity between the two of them. Some of the mannerisms were quite similar. Not that it was different between the two versions of Ove, because it was like a really tall bloke as well. There was a particular scene where they had gone out for dinner. Now that was the bit that had me in bits, when he was trying to explain how he had only taken like soup so that she could get whatever she wanted, and then explained that he wasn't going to join the army and all this. But yeah, that was a nice wee touching moment. That was kind of lovely. And they did alter how they told the story. There was certain things that were told in the Swedish one that wasn't in the US one, and vice versa. There was things, mostly sort of background stuff in terms of where he came from and what he was doing. Like in the Swedish one, he had a job, for instance. He was already working. And it was just mentioned in passing that he was. In fact, it wasn't even mentioned in passing that he was. It had a medical or anything like that. It was just a kind of a sideline. So there was wee things in there that they changed, but didn't really alter the story. But I thought that in the US version, there was more explanation, if you like. I don't know if it's just because it's for a more general audience or what, but there was certain things in there that they just did not mention in the Swedish one. But again, they both worked, but in slightly different ways. And I preferred the Swedish one just because I kind of liked the voiceover, because that added an extra element to it. It was like somebody telling a story rather than you just seeing. Because the voiceover didn't give any more depth to it, if you like. Well, in a way it did. It gave a wee bit more depth to his relationship with his father. And he explained
definitely in the Swedish version, because you get a sense of the morals that were instilled in him as a child, working alongside his father. You see a lot more of the trauma, I guess, that he goes through as a child. So I do think it's more revelatory, but I actually think that because his delivery is quite dispassionate, because that's who he's become, this old grump, it's not a sensationalized kind of revisiting of the past. It's just, these are the things that have happened.
Yes, there's the only reason that he's delving into the past is to explain a certain element of what's actually happening in the present. And it doesn't need to be sensational or anything. I did particularly like the way that the father-son interactions happened, because there was another film that I saw it was years ago, and it was a sort of father and son dynamic. And it was, even in the toughest of times between them, they always had something they could talk about. And between them, it was baseball. And between Ove and his father, who was Ove as well, I got my name from my father. It was cars. And that kind of explained part of the plot as well, with his neighbour, why that was so important to him, because that was a link to his past, because he always, a Saab will never let you down, that kind of idea. And it meant that even though his father was in bits because his wife and Ove's mother had left, they found a way to talk to each other and continued to talk to each other, even when it was very difficult for them to sort of confront sort of realities of life. If they can stand and talk about a car, talk about carburetors for half an hour, then they've got something to talk about, and they'll never have a blocker, which is very, very important. I do the same thing with my son with Star Wars. Although we've never come. No, seriously, because we've always had that link where we talk about Star Wars all the time.
No, I get you. I'm not
that.
laughing in that. I'm not laughing in that sense. I just imagine that I think what I really liked in the Swedish dynamic was this sort of sense of they were talking about cars, so they didn't have to talk about any of the hard subjects. Whereas I don't believe that you and your son have ever avoided having a hard and emotional conversation. Whereas in this, it was like, because that was so instilled in him, you saw that in later life. So when he first takes Sonia out for dinner and he starts describing, I was like being in a date with my own husband, starts describing the engine of a car, and she's like, and she's kind of looking at him like, what are you doing? Because she's not, but that's his way of communicating, because that's what he's learned. It's like, don't talk about the hard stuff, talk about something that's practical and something that you know about. So it's a lovely wee touch.
Yeah, because when they're sitting in the restaurant and they're facing each other, and round about them it's all couples as well, and you hear a wee laugh coming from the left and from the right, and they're looking about and they're thinking, everybody else is having quite a nice time here, and it's very, very awkward. So that's what you're right. He uses his fallback mechanism in order to at least initiate a conversation with her. And obviously they come from different worlds where they've got different coping mechanisms. She's got her literature that she always reads. She's always got books and everything, whereas he's got his cars. Now, in the Swedish version, that was just, that's what they do. But she said, oh, my dad liked cars as well. So there's a link there right away. But when the young Otto meets Sonia for the first time, that they don't have that. They don't have that commonality between them. She doesn't say anything about cars and stuff. So it's always like a wee difference. She just takes that as a bit of a quirk that he has. And it's explained later on that he doesn't read books at all. He's not really interested. It's something that Sonia does and what she's interested in. But they can quite happily cohabit, knowing that they like different things. Because I suppose that's the kind of basis for any sort of relationship, isn't it? Commonality, but, there are differences in there.
Oh, I mean, the wife reads books, the husband likes cars. It was like, no wonder I was sobbing. I think one thing, though, that I think the film does, and this is going to sound really strange for a film about an old man trying to end himself, I actually think the humour is done really well throughout. And even that wee moment where he starts talking about cars in the restaurant, I actually found quite funny. And you mentioned, like, in the English language version, him chasing after the UPS truck, saying that's not a racist thing. But even, and again, it's insane, but even the way he tries to kill himself is actually done quite funny in a funny way initially, because his problem is not himself. His problem is that, screws and ropes and all that, they're just not made as robustly as they used to. So what did you think about how it sort of brought humour into obviously quite a dark subject?
It was clever because you didn't really expect it to be treated in that way. You expected it to be treated more seriously. But yes, it was quite dark, the humour in a lot of places. But again, it was kind of a coping mechanism for the main character, because he was using humour in a way. It was being sort of matter of fact about it, but you could tell that he knew what he was doing in terms of like why he was saying certain things, and sometimes it was looking for a reaction. And you could see there was a scene where, I can't remember, but they kind of broke through to each other and they had a good laugh about something, and you could see him actually laughing, and they were pushing each other and things. It was just this lovely moment, and you could see that even he recognized that he was able to sort of laugh at himself. But yes, it was strange how, like, doing suicide things and then saying, I can't do it just now because I've got things to do. I've got responsibilities, and that's part of the whole story. It's showing that even though he's had enough and it's time to go and be with Sonia, all these interruptions happen as well. And just the way that he almost accepted them with a sigh, and I've got to do this now and all that. So I thought it worked very nicely. What did you think?
Yeah, no, I definitely, even, this is going to sound really silly, but even the way that he was preparing for his death, like he obviously didn't want to make a mess, so there was newspapers going down or like sheets and stuff like that, and even that did kind of make me laugh. But I definitely think that in a way Ove, or Otto, is one of these people that he's always been, probably I think, slightly odd, and the older he's got, the more sort of this is grown into sort of grumpiness. But as you say, sometimes there was a wee twinkle in his eye with what he was saying, so he knew when he was being obtuse or he was trying to get a wee laugh out of them, and so he did have a sense of humour there. It's just that obviously, you know, one of the most poignant lines in the film and indeed the book is, you know, he said, "My life was all colour when Sonia was here and she took the colour with her," and I think that's quite striking in the sense that he almost didn't want to have a laugh about anything anymore because he couldn't see the point in it because there was nobody to share it with, but he was still really funny.
Yes, and that ties in quite nicely with the family that moves across the road. We haven't actually mentioned them yet. That
No.
a family moves in across the road now. In the Swedish version, they are Persian from Iran. They fled from Iran because of conflict there, whereas in the Philly version, they are Mexican.
Yeah.
And they've moved across and they've got like a couple of kids and stuff like that. Now, when he starts interacting with the children and they start calling him abuelo or grandpa or whatever, which is quite nice. What you mentioned there about the colour going out of his life, when he gets pictures from the kids, he's the only one in colour in the pictures.
Oh, I'm going to start crying again.
The rest of them are in black and white and he's in colour, so they recognise that there's something missing, so they're trying to bring a wee bit of colour back into his life, which is a really, really subtle way of doing that, and it really works very well. It was, you know.
Oh, absolutely, and it ties into this notion that kids are obviously a lot more observant than perhaps people give them credit for, but in both cases. So in the Swedish version, Parvani is the female neighbour who moves in and sort of takes an interest in Ove, and in the English language version, it's a woman called Marisol. But I think I was actually going to ask you what you thought of them, is because obviously we only see Sonia in flashbacks, so we've got no sense of her in the present day. What did you think of them as the sort of female counterparts to these grumpy old men?
They were sort of very confident people who have endured circumstances, different sort of circumstances, but still they've obviously had to work for absolutely everything they've got. In both cases, they've come to a country where they don't speak the language and they have to learn it, even though their husbands do actually speak the language. I think in the Swedish version, her husband is Swedish.
Yeah.
Whereas in the Otto version, it is, I think he's Spanish, but he's Mexican,
he's
but
from
already
California.
Speaking, so he already speaks English as well. So there's that. The way that they have to just get on with it, they're sort of forcing themselves to actually be better and be able to be in a position where they can provide for the families and the things that they need to do in order to do that. But in addition to doing everything they're needing to do, they're taking time out to try and bring a bit of joy to this grumpy old man who lives next door. Now, it could have been quite easy for them just to ignore him after he helped them park their car for the first time. But she was always back and forth, talking to him, cajoling, laughing with him, or trying to get something from him. There was like two bits where, it was in the Otto version, where they were coming back from the hospital after her husband had fallen off a ladder, which we knew that was going to happen.
He didn't read the manual.
He didn't read the manual, and he didn't put up the supports. And she turns to him and she says, "My father always smiled like that." And he says, "But I'm not smiling." And she says, "I know," which can be taken two ways. It was quite a nice comic moment, but
it was lovely.
Kind of like, it sort of showed where she's come from as well. And then there was something later on where, and I've had to write this down as well, she said, "Every word you say is like a warm cuddle," and it was said in the most sarcastic way possible, which was just great. So these characters were the sort of the complete counterpoint to the male lead in this, and they were full of life to the point they were almost bursting in terms of what they had and what they were giving out, and the sort of the vibe that they had with the people all around them. So it was a nice balance there, because you needed that. You didn't need somebody who was the same. You needed that exuberant, but not over the top. They still felt realistic. They didn't feel like sort of caricatures of a certain type of person. they felt real, which is no mean feat with that kind of role, you know. So it was done very well on both occasions.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely, there's, for me, what I was worried about, particularly in the English language version, but this was going to slip into a caricature of a person from a certain country, but actually,
Yeah.
it definitely avoided that. But I think for me, what's interesting is that Otto himself has endured a lot of hardship. And I think in a way that's what, whilst they're not like mirror images of each other, they are kind of kindred spirits, because he's also sort of dragged himself up by the bootstraps and kind of dragged himself through life really as well, and managed to get a job and all that sort of thing, and survived obviously quite a traumatic childhood. So I think in a way he probably does see a bit of himself in them, and that's why in both cases, in the Swedish and English film, he gives, when he's trying to teach Parveni or Marisol how to drive, she gets this kind of impassioned speech for him where he's like, you're not an idiot. He was like, you've survived this, you know, you're married to your nitwit husband, you've got 2 kids, another one on the way. But that's his way of sort of, I guess, showing some understanding and I guess gratefulness as well, that they haven't maybe given up on him as well.
Yeah, that I liked that speech. That was really good because it kind of showed that he wasn't doing this sort of thing under pressure. That was just when he was teaching her to drive. He was doing it because he recognized something in her that was important for him to try and nurture as well. He was trying to help her as best as he could in the way that she was developing as a person and developing as a mother and all that as well. So yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, really nice.
So I think what I really like about the Parveni and the Marisol characters is they both have a really strong sense of community, and perhaps that is partly to do with their cultural backgrounds. But I think for me, in general, both these films have a lot to say about, well, old age for starters, obviously, and community. What did you sort of take away from that? Something similar, or like how did you feel like it built up this notion of, well, one, the sort of community that Ove and Otto both live in and how that all functions, but also about what it had to say about old age, because it's not just Ove or Otto that's being sort of sidelined or marginalized within that housing community.
There's threats to the community which are slightly different in the films. One is got to do with, well, the Swedish one has got to do with the sort of loss of a family unit as part of it. That's one of the main subplots, whereas the English language one is more, the subplot there is more to do with the sort of urbanization of areas and the fact that you're not part of a community anymore. It's all, it's just units, it's condo units they're talking about. There's not the same sense of community now. Otto and his friend, and Ove and his friend, were the ones who set up everything initially within their communities, sort of started the morning routine of checking that everything works okay. And I think their wives were kind of like, yeah, you go on, dear.
You do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they both speak in terms of having a dream, and it's a dream that they had together and it was for the community. It wasn't their dream. It was to make things more pleasant for everybody around. So they didn't want like cars traveling through this area. They wanted everything to be tidy and clean so that families can enjoy it and it's like a lovely place to live. So it's more than what they were just wanting. And the fact that they both got sidelined due to age and illness is just a symptom of life, because at some point you do get sidelined and it's up to the next generation to come on and either do the same thing or develop it from there. And that is one of the reasons why he's so angry, because he doesn't see that. He sees more of an emphasis on the frivolous, going to lunch in the case of the sales assistant, you know, when you say, I want to speak to your manager, or my manager's at lunch. So it's that kind of thing. It's like, it is a wee bit of like old man shouting at cloud, but there's a reason. There is when you actually figure out why he's like that, you can see, and it is that you can see the community around him actually disappearing because people don't talk to each other. They're always having a go at each other for whatever reason, like the woman with the wee dog with the booties on and all this sort of stuff, and this dog's
Oh,
peeing
see, when he
everywhere.
said he was going to, what is it? He says I'm going to make that furry slipper into a boot. I was cussing myself laughing at that. It was really good.
So that's what I took from it. It was the loss of community was the reason why he was driving so hard to get things done. And what that resulted in his old age was it was basically letters to the council and just complaints and everything. There was, he felt a wee bit powerless. It was very little he could do as an individual because he wasn't getting the backup from people around him, because they all had their own problems, especially his friends. They had their own problems and they didn't want to worry him with their problems either. So there was kind of like, well, it's one of the sort of cornerstones of a good drama, isn't it? A bit of miscommunication, so that, you know, a bit of a misunderstanding. So therefore that kind of builds tension and it actually creates drama as well. So yes, that was all in there. But that's kind of what I took from it. What about you?
I think for me, there's a couple of things. So the Anita and Rune, or Anita and Ruben, in the English language version, their characters, I felt really, really emotionally involved in their situation. So Rune or Ruben appears to have been rendered completely incapacitated by a stroke, you know, is in a wheelchair, he's not speaking, he just sits and gazes out the window all day. And in the Swedish version, they're trying to basically ship him off to a home without any sort of consent. And the same thing in the English language version, but the twist in that is that their son has signed off on his father being shipped into a home. And I guess for me, it kind of highlighted just the vulnerability of older people in society, because if they don't have that sense of community and people looking out for them and making sure that, you know, they've got what they, you know, do they have their path swept? Do they have provisions when it's cold outside? You know, is their heating working? It does make you think about, you know, who is checking in on people. And I think in the English language version, this whole kind of social media and being engrossed in your phone culture is really, really hammered home when a man takes a heart attack and falls onto the train tracks, and Otto looks around at everybody else and they're all filming it as opposed to doing something about it. And of course, he jumps onto the track, saves the guy who's the hero of the day. So for me, that was slightly on the nose, but it was making a point that who's actually paying it. There's a big difference between watching and paying attention. And it seemed like nobody was paying attention, which I quite liked.
Yeah, no, you're right. And you've got to remember there is a 7-year difference between these films. So in that 7 years, social media ballooned in so many ways and more people had access to smartphones and everything. So therefore there was a slight element of it within the Swedish version. The reporter in it, though, was a local newspaper reporter, whereas in the US version, it was a social media reporter, because they said, you know, what the hell's that? What does that actually mean? You know, so. But yes, you're right. It was a little bit on the nose in terms of people not doing anything apart from, the first thing they do is they whip out the phone and they take videos of it. Now, we've seen that over the last weekend with all these riots that are going on. Now, there's all these people taking part in it, but there's equally same number of people who are standing the sidelines with their phones up, just watching it, you know, just going, this will make great content, you know, that'll go on my TikTok account, you know, that kind of thing. So it does happen, and it is very relevant to, you know, what is going on and what has been going on over the last couple of years. But yeah, it was a little on the nose. You would get someone else helping pull
you presumably wouldn't have the only other elderly gentleman on the train platform jumping in. But again, I guess it just goes to, like, you know, in both cases, you know, Ove and Otto are writing angry letters and stuff like that, and he has a landline in both cases as well. And I do think it's obviously just these wee touches that again just show that wee disconnect between, because I don't know anyone my age that has a landline or has indeed used a landline for the past, you know, 10, 15 years, whatever. So again, I guess it was just showing the fact that in both cases, for both characters, they can't understand why society doesn't need them anymore, because as far as they're concerned, they've got the practical solutions, they've got the answers, they've got the manuals. Their way of doing things is the way that they see things working. And so it just furthers this disconnect between what they're seeing and how they feel about the sort of community that they are living in, or the wider city that they are sort of shopping and stuff in as well.
Yeah, it is the whole the world's gone mad kind of thing, isn't it?
Yes.
And having a bit of nostalgia for, something that actually probably didn't exist in the first place, but it's, the ideal that they're looking back on, the sort of cozy past and all that. It gives them a bit of comfort. Yeah.
And do you think that both films then sort of managed to tread that line between like poignant and nostalgic and schmaltzy? Do you think it? I think the Swedish one definitely does. I'm not convinced about the American one ever so slightly.
I think you're right. Yes, the Swedish one is slightly more contained in that way. A lot of it's got, without going into spoilers, of course, a lot of that has to do with the way that the story is tied up. Now, the plot point about his friend Rune getting put into care get tied up in about 10 minutes without really any sort of preamble to it, whereas the US version kind of explained things a bit more. It spent there was a difference of about 15 minutes in the runtime in this film. So
was there?
In that, yes,
didn't even clock that.
Yeah, the Tom Hanks one was about just 2 hours 10 minutes, I think it was, and the other one was an hour and 50 something.
Couldn't see the clock for my tears.
Yeah, surprisingly, you could see the screen for your tears. So. But yes, things were explained a little bit more in the US one, in terms of the way that it ended. Especially, there was this sort of, it was almost like an epilogue part to it, which wasn't in the Swedish film. That really just ended, and it was less schmaltzy for that. And there was even things like there was the bit where he get kicked out of the hospital for attacking the clown. Now, in the Swedish version, that wasn't really explained about the significance of the coin.
No.
But in the US one, it was. You got to understand why he actually. Now, I don't know if that was in the book or not. It probably was explained in the book, but it wasn't in the Swedish one. So there was things in the Swedish one that you were kind of left to sort of work out for yourself, but it was all there on the screen on the other version. Now, I don't know if that's because they reckon people in the English language are sort of harder thinking sometimes. I kind of get that. In terms of films, they do tend to do that when they do remakes of films. They have a wee bit more exposition. They have
there's a lot more telling than showing.
Yes, there was quite a few examples of that in the remake rather than the original. Some of it worked well, some of it didn't work well, as far as I was concerned. It skated over his relationship with his father, for a start. That was just, they had a relationship, and that there wasn't very much to it after that, whereas, like we've discussed previously, there was whole sections about them interacting and how they got on and how he came to be looking to enlist in the army in the first place. So it is a bit of a balance, I suppose, but overall, I think the remake was a wee bit more. It was tied up nicer in a bow.
Yeah, I do think it must be difficult, especially, as I say, when you have a novel in particular, one that's been such a phenomenal success. How you choose what you show, what you don't show, what you're keeping in, what elements you're, even what characters you're removing or whatever. So I do think it's interesting in that they are. As I say, if you watch them back to back, you probably would think that you've watched the same film, just a different language. But there are wee elements where you are noticing the differences, and I guess it's obviously choice from directors and writers on both sides as to what they're going to include. But I definitely felt like as I say, for me, the Otto character was softened a lot, and that changed my viewing relationship with the film, I guess, because it did feel a bit more on, as I say, on the nose at other points, and a wee bit as you say, too neat in a bow at other points, whereas the Swedish language version was a bit more gruff, I think.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Part of the difference that I did note was with regards to the soundtrack that was used. Now,
Yes.
in the remake, it was Thomas Newman that did the soundtrack, top Hollywood composer, and it was fine. It was nice, but I actually preferred the Swedish one, which I didn't expect to, because obviously I kind of like Thomas Newman stuff anyway. But it was
Yeah.
Gout Storas who did the Swedish one, and the reason I liked that better was because Ove had a theme.
Yeah.
There was a piece of music that they played, I think maybe like 3 or 4 times in the film, and it was played in different ways. It was played when he was doing his initial checks of the surrounding area, when he was on his rounds, and it was sort of militaristic, because it
Yeah.
had quite a tight sort of snare beat going on, and it was almost like a marching theme. But then when they played it again, it was during a scene where he was reflecting on his past, and the song was more mournful and everything. And it was just slight differences like that. And they did that on a few occasions, just use it, but they didn't overuse it. Whereas the remake didn't have that same impact in terms of the soundtrack for me. It was there. It was good, but it didn't have the same oomph. Now, in terms of the songs and all that, yeah, there was different songs that they used. Like, say, they used the Kate Bush song, and that was phenomenal. It worked really, really well. But there was 2 songs I think they used, one where he was in the car on his own, and
I love that song.
But it seemed a wee bit like something he wouldn't listen to.
Yeah, so that was my big thing with that. So actually, I totally agree with what you're saying. That song I do really like, but there is no way he would have switched on his car radio and that's what would have been playing. So it did seem quite jarring, and it wasn't meant to be like soundtrack or score. It was meant to be coming out the radio, and it didn't land as well as it should have, I don't think.
No, and the Swedish version had another English language song on it, which I can't remember, but it just seemed far more appropriate. It was more like a country song or something. It just felt like something that he would listen to. And I mean, but like I say, it was a small point, but it's the kind of thing that you notice, because in a film or films that are this good, you tend to pick at the wee bits that you have issue with, just because, well, it gives us something to talk about for an hour, doesn't it? I suppose more than anything else. Yeah.
And I suppose the defining question is, which lead character do you think smelled more of peppermints and newsprint?
Oh, definitely Ove. Yes.
Oh yeah. His cardigan in particular, I was drawn to, and his little bonnet that he had as he was walking about. I was like, this man absolutely. I bet he's getting newsprint still in his fingers, because obviously he would read a newspaper and not read his news online. But I don't know why. I think it's just things like old people holding hands in real life like makes me cry. But when you've got vulnerable old people in films as well, I'm like, I wonder what kind of peppermint they smell like.
That was interesting as well, because for the majority of the film, when he was out and about, he would wear his jacket and it was zipped up. And that's kind of like part of his armor, part of his cloak to keep him safe. But towards the end, the zip was gone and his jacket was more open. He was still wearing the bonnet, but it was slightly more, it was just a subtle way of saying this man is more open to what is going on around him. Whereas with the remake, he was just wearing this big puffer jacket all the time, this big sort of heavyweight jacket, which, it was just something that didn't kind of focus on. And there was another wee bit, just it kind of cemented things for me in terms of the character. When he was in the car, and this is before he switched on the radio and stuff, and he had the hose and all that put in, the first thing he did was he put the car into neutral before actually switching it on. It was just a silly wee attention to detail that you knew that somebody like that would do, because he wouldn't have the car, he wouldn't put the car in gear in case it's kind of bumped forward. And it's just, and it was really, really trivial, but I picked up on it when I saw it, and I said, that's exactly what I would do. So he's obviously had a lot of time to think about what would this character actually be like? What would he do? And it's methodical what he does. And Just it was a lovely wee touch. I just really liked that.
Yeah, I do feel like, and as I say, I've read the book, and I think, funnily enough, looks wise, again, this is nothing because it's just my imagination, obviously, as I'm reading,
Yeah.
but I do think looks wise, Rolf Lassgård is so much closer to what I imagined in my head. But as you say, it's these like meticulous little details that absolutely, when you're obviously reading about this character and it's a lot more fleshed out than what you see on screen, that is the type of behavior that he would engage in. So it did feel like a really nice character study from him at times, where, as you say, you're picking up on things like that, where, and even just like when he goes to the recycling at the start and he's looking at it and he separates the lids from the jar and he throws them both in, and it's just like these perfect little wee moments where I'm like, yeah, you would absolutely do this. And even just the way like he shoveled the snow, like there was a really precise method as to how he was doing it, and he cleared like this exact wee space, and it's beautiful moments like that. You're just like, that is somebody who's really, really thrown themselves into understanding this character, and also understands that this character carries a lot of weight, because he is obviously the lead of the film, but he's carried these sort of huge kind of social issues along with him, as we said, like old age, community, all that sort of thing. And I think just those little wee touches is what makes it really, really authentic, and just you want to sort of, he would hate it, but you would want to sort of wrap him up in a hug. And
Yep, definitely. Yep.
So I'm assuming you would recommend both of these films to people that were looking for a watch, either the Swedish language or the English language film, yeah?
Yes, I would recommend watching the Swedish film first and then maybe giving it a couple of months so that it's not completely fresh in your mind, and then watching the remake. And in that way, you will get to enjoy both films. And if you've got a memory anything like mine, then you'll enjoy them even more because you've forgotten what the first one was actually like. Yes, yeah. I think that's probably the order I would recommend seeing them in.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I feel like, in a way, I'm not saying it's completely changed my mind in English language remakes, but actually this is one of the better ones that I've seen. But definitely, because it does have those moments that are slightly more on the nose and slightly more cheesy than perhaps I would have liked, I would say watch the Swedish one first, give it some time. And I mean, I'm the same. I watch films, and if I don't make notes, it's out of my head. So definitely watch that one first, then have a look at the Tom Hanks remake. I definitely think that they're both on merit. They both definitely have things that are worth looking at. And if you're anything like me, get the tissues ready because it's going to be a long 2 hours.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely, yes.
Is there anything else you'd like to add about these lovely films?
No, I've pretty much covered it. I think Man Called Ove is available on Mubi at the moment. And A Man Called Otto, I think you need to buy it at the moment. I don't think it's streaming.
Yeah, you can rent or buy it on Prime. Yeah.
So it's weird, isn't it, how there's an awful lot of stuff that you just have no access to without actually paying for it. I know like a subscription is kind of a payment anyway, but you know, like a film that's only 2 years old, you'd have thought that maybe it would still be on one of the sort of main streaming services. I think it was at one point, but it's probably just a license thing. Yeah, nothing else to say apart from I really enjoyed both of them, and yeah, it's good.
Yeah. Also, it's quite funny actually now that you're saying that, because maybe I associate with being this like highfalutin like streamer platform with like all this, really difficult to watch like European or world films. So it's quite interesting that that's landed on that platform. And A Man Called Otto has landed on Prime, which primarily is more accessible. So even just funny to note those two things. But that is everything from the latest Moviescramble podcast. Have you seen A Man Called Ove? Have you seen A Man Called Otto? Tell us your thoughts. What are your thoughts on English language remakes in general? And if you want to get in touch with us and tell us those thoughts, you can reach us on podcast@moviescramble.co.uk or on all the usual social channels where we will be at Moviescramble. So until next time, it is goodbye from me and my esteemed colleague.
Bye.